going to start working with Redshift. Um, so I'm going to try and keep this broken up into small pieces. I tend to be long-winded, so we'll see how well that goes. All right, so to start with, this is our base scene. You could start with a sphere and a plane. It doesn't really matter. Some of the things I hope to show in this tutorial are a basic introduction to Redshift, some of the things you need to do to get set up, some of the differences, and then I will probably break it into pieces, but we'll look at how to use hair in Redshift. Certain things don't work in Redshift that do work in the standard render engine. So we'll talk about some of those things. Okay, so let's get going. So first, this is my scene. It's this weird kind of tree stumpy thing. You can see I did a great job modeling it. It's totally professionally done. For those of you in the class, if you want to look through, you can see, how I made this tree. It's pretty ugly, but it's got some growths on it. And we're going to basically be eventually we'll be putting grass, which we're going to need to use the hair engine to do on here. And then we'll add some texture on these as well as some sort of growth. And then there's just an area light. If I render this now with the standard renderer, you can kind of see what it looks like. Fantastic, right? Okay. So why do we want to use Redshift? There's several reasons. Redshift is significantly faster. It's progressive. Depending on your system, it runs on the GPU. And that means that it can go it can render more quickly. You get essentially it shortens the feedback loop. And it gives you a lot of power and control over your scene once you get things known. Now, there's also other exciting things like the pyro materials, where basically you can create fires, explosions, smoke, and all of that as well. It does lighting with fog and things like that really well too. It's just a really robust and awesome render system. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we want to do is we want to change our render settings so we're using the Redshift renderer. So when I come in here, I come over here, you'll see that I have hair render turned on. I'm actually going to see if I can just get this out of here for now. You may have it on already as well, but I want to make sure that that's gone so that when we get into Redshift, we turn everything on and make sure we do it correctly. So first, we have the standard renderer. What we want to do is we want to change to Redshift. And we're just going to leave it at basic. If we click on Redshift, you'll see there's several options here. We're going to leave everything exactly as it stands right now, just because it's going to make this process go a lot faster. But there are significantly more options you can see as if you want to go deeper into this. But again, this is just an introduction. Okay, so we've set up our render settings. Now there's a couple other changes that we need to make. The first one being this light. All the lights that, like if you've made lights or you've dropped lights in that and you don't have Redshift turned on, you're going to need to convert those so that they work with the Redshift engine as intended. They will still light the scene. If I was to render to the viewport right now, you'll see it's taking a little second, and you'll see it's lighting the scene, but it's also like totally blasting everything out. It's much lighter. And you'll notice that by default, and maybe you don't notice this, but by default, Redshift uses global illumination, right? Light is bouncing off of surfaces and back onto other surfaces. And so that's not something you need to enable, like in the standard render engine. And you'll notice it goes a lot faster than the standard render engine with global illumination turned on. Okay, so the first step is I'm going to take this light, and instead of having to delete it and put a new light in, fortunately, there is this convert to Redshift button here. So if I go ahead and just click convert to Redshift, and then select my light again, you'll see the icon has changed up here, and my settings are very different. So we're going to go ahead and look at a couple other differences. I want you to look at the tools here on the side, right? There's now, instead of Sun and Sky Rig, there's RS, right? These are Redshift Sun and Sky Rig, Redshift Sky, Redshift Environment. If we click over here, there's like the standard camera, motion camera, and crane camera. We're not going to worry about those. Those should be about the same. But then under lights, there's a couple of other options here. There's dome light, and there's, yeah, but otherwise these are all now, since we're in Redshift, since we're rendering in Redshift mode, these are all different lights and things that are specifically for Redshift. So we don't need to do that conversion any further. Okay, something else to note is materials in Redshift are totally different. And unfortunately, you cannot convert your materials to Redshift materials. You have to do a little bit more work. But if I click on the plus sign for new materials, I just want to show you that now, if I go to materials, all of these, this icon, the circle with the, I don't know, the smile under it, I don't know, it's like a smiling cyclops of the materials, right? All of these are Redshift materials. And so you'll see that there's a whole bunch of options in here, and these are all, these are basically different places to get you started. They're presets, and then you can make adjustments from there. And we're going to look at a couple of these options. Notice there is one for hair, there's one for skin. Skin and subsurface scattering are similar, but this is just very specifically tuned to be skin. The pyro volume and volumes, particles, there's all sorts of exciting things in here. Notice that in this, we can actually create lights from this menu as well. And then there's some utilities. We're not going to worry about these right now. We're just going to keep this simple. Okay, so we've got some of these changes going on. So the next step is something that's going to make life a little bit easier for us. Okay, so what we're going to do first is we're going to make some layout changes. So we're going to go up to Window at the top of the screen. And one of the things that we definitely want to have up here in our layout is the Redshift render view. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this RS render view. It's, 3/4 of the way down the page. And you can see this is what I was rendering last. It looks really weird. But if I go ahead and turn that off, what we want to do is we don't want this to be just like floating in front of our view. It's super obnoxious. We'd like to be able to be working on our scene and have this render view up at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and click on here. I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to put this down. In my case, I think I'd like it below my main view here. And of course, now that it's in here, right, I can pull this up or down. If I was to hit play on this, what this does is it's going to do a progressive render of my scene. And you can see it's going through, and by default, it's set to do 1024 passes to slowly refine the quality of this image, right? But what's nice about this is Redshift is fast enough that if I rotate my scene, if I click over here somewhere, I rotate my view, right, it's going to update almost in real time. Obviously, I'm not getting the full view, but it gives me a really quick and easy way to work. So we definitely want this in our scene. And right, we're not going to be doing a whole lot of modeling, so that doesn't have to be huge right now. But we will be adding these things on here. Okay, let's close that up. And the other thing to note is this is set to 100% right now, original size, and I can just say, it might be easier to just say fit window. And that way I'm getting the same view, but I'm actually getting everything in view in here. Again, you can change, you can say original size, right? Or whatever you want it to be. But we're just going to say fit window. There are some other things you can do. You can take snapshots and stuff. We're not going to get into that right now. But yeah, if I go ahead and if I click stop, so this is not purple anymore, then if I rotate my view or whatever, it's not going to be updating that. Right. And basically, if your computer is angry when you're trying to do things in here and render this, it's good to stop it while you make some major changes, and then you can turn it back on again. Okay, so now we've got this set. There may be some other things we want to add eventually, so we can have some other tools available to us. But what we're going to do is we are going to save this as a new layout so that when we come in and we're working with Redshift, we have this set up. So all we have to do is hit plus over here, and we're going to say save layout as. And I am going to call this, it is not standard. We'll leave all of those values there probably, but I'm going to call this Redshift. And I think this sets it in the first position. We'll see what happens. Maybe angry with me. Yeah, so it sticks it all the way over here, right? So it's the 0th one. I'm sure each one of these is a slightly different number at this point. But basically, now we have a Redshift layout. So we don't have to have this thing floating in front of us, and we can also update it as we go. Okay, so we've got our one light in Redshift. We have no materials whatsoever, but let's go ahead and look at some of our light attributes and kind of come to understand some of the differences. So the first thing I want you to note is the type is area. Again, we can change, right? We could, just like in the other settings, we can switch between types of light if we want to. I'm going to leave it set to area. Something to note is right now the intensity and the exposure. Sometimes when you create a light, the intensity is going to be like 100,000 or something. It's crazy. Right now it's 3.14, which actually is pretty good. But these two values together really make a difference in terms of what this looks like. If I increase the exposure some, it should brighten this up. Oh, but of course I have to be having this live update, right? So you can see I've increased the exposure. It's increasing, right, the exposure. There's a lot more light coming in. If I undo those last couple steps, something else to note, when I brought this light in, it had no decay. Quadratic is the default. So if I was to create a new Redshift light, like let's say I make a spotlight, and I pull the spotlight over and lift it up, you'll see that it automatically has a quadratic decay. You'll also note that the intensity is 250,000 and the exposure is 0, right? So I'm getting about the same light I had before, but this is blasted way far out. So I'm going to turn this light off, and I'm going to select this light again, and you'll see that 3.14 with a quadratic decay is not going to cut the bacon. So even 100, right? Not getting anywhere. So let's go up to 10,000. Right? Okay, so now we're starting to get some light in the scene. What's nice about this is we have we end up having like a huge range of possibilities in terms of lighting. But if I go to 100,000 with an exposure of 0, that's just about right for how far away this is from the object. And so it's something that you have to get used to. But right, just know that your intensity here is, are very large values. But you can see how nice this lighting is. There's some really great gray tones in there. Again, what happens here is you get your intensity kind of tuned in, and then you can use exposure to push it or pull it a little bit one way or the other. If we go down a little bit further, there's units. We're just going to leave it in image format for now. If we go down, we can do color. So we can choose any color of the rainbow, right? RGB, hue, saturation, whatever. We could be like, oh, I really want this to be like a kind of blue light, right? So we can choose a color that way. We can also change this to temperature. And so if we change this to temperature, we just scroll down a little bit more, and you'll see the temperature here, right? So I can make this cooler, or I can, because I never learn. I just had the great experience of having this crash without saving it. So please save frequently, save often. I think it's because I'm using QuickTime to do screen recording at the same time that I'm using Redshift. And I think those two things are fighting pretty horribly with one another. Okay, so where I was is we had changed from color to temperature. So this is another way you can set lights, right, based on temperature, degrees Kelvin, just like, this is more accurate to how white light looks to us, whether it's sunlight, what time of day, right? You'll notice that you probably know this already, but most LED lights, it tells you what number of degrees Kelvin they are on the packaging, whether they're warm or cool. So higher values are cool. And so because I've been having issues, I just want to make sure that I'm starting and stopping the IPR here. But you can see, right, this is setting this to be more cool. If I was to pop over here to something warmer, right, you can see that again, this value is pretty low. That's warmer. I'm going to stop this again. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to color and temperature. So this blends those two things together. So it's both the warmth of the temperature plus the color. If I go ahead and render this, so now, right, I should get that like green because it's sunset or sunrise or something, and the light that I'm seeing is blue. There's times when this is really useful. What's nice is that you can tune things a little bit if you can't get exactly the color that you want out of this. Okay, so the other thing that we can do is we can put textures in our light, right? So we can color the light with a texture. So I'm just going to go back to color. I'm going to come down here to this texture. I am just going to search for some sort of JPEG or TIFF. I've got a bunch in here. That's going to be boring. Let's see here. Here we go. Let's put Bob Ross's face. There we go. Beautiful. As the color. So I'm going to open this. I'm going to say yes. And if I go ahead and render this now, it should, let's see here, add his face to the lighting. I don't know why Bob Ross is not. Is not showing up like it's supposed to. And maybe Bob's in there, but just barely. We'll, when we start using some volumetric lighting, hopefully Bob will show up for us in this light. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and if I make this white, maybe we get, I think we're getting some of the color of Bob on here because this is a lot warmer than a purely white light should be. So it's blending in there. We just don't see it that well. But I want to, once we get to adding some fog to this scene, you'll kind of see how those colors impact the image. Okay, so I'm going to go back to something. I'm actually going to keep this white right now and leave Bob on there. But so, right, so we've got this scene here. Everything is good. We've got our one light. Note that the area shape, we can do basically all the same shapes that we were able to do in the standard or physical render engine. We can adjust the size here. The one last thing we have is spread. If I was to shrink this down, maybe there we go. Now we can see Bob's face on the tree, right? So what spread does is basically, right, is the light just straight beams, totally collimated going at the scene, or are all of those points spreading out and becoming more diffuse? And so currently Bob is on top of the tree. Let's go ahead and move the scene a little bit so we can maybe get a better view of him. Let's look around, right? I can see his eye. That's kind of creepy. Right, so this is, right, the spread is set to 0 currently, so it's as sharp as it can possibly be. Note that it's basically, right, I have a rectangle of light, and everything else is only being illuminated by the light bouncing off of this surface and hitting those and then coming to the camera. So if I make my spread, you can adjust your spread. So now it's more, of the sense of the color. What's nice about this is you can have a light that is essentially like scene lighting. And so you can get color and a variety of color on your surface. You can create some really nice effects using that type of projection and get some nice variation in the color that you've got on your screen. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop my IPR now. I'm going to save this because it's been crashing. Okay. So that's the basics of lights. There's a bunch of other details here. Note that cast shadow is on by default. That is a fabulous, fabulous thing. And you can do project, so you can exclude or include objects just like you can with other lights. In Cinema, there's a whole bunch of other settings here in terms of contributions for all these other things in caustic photons. We're not going to worry about any of that right now. As I said, this is an introduction. Okay, so we've got our base object. So let's go ahead and look at Redshift materials because these are really different. So we're going to go ahead and go to the plus sign. Actually, no, we're not. We're going to say create. We're going to go to materials. Oh, dang it. Okay, so before we do that, it looks like I didn't even save it before I had switched to Redshift. So we are going to do that. I'm going to delete this again. Okay. Oh my Lord, I love it when it crashes. I'm going to save this again. Okay, so now we're actually using the Redshift render engine. What's interesting is that the render view with the Redshift camera was still working, with the Redshift light was still working, but for some reason it didn't save the render settings. It's so odd. Okay, so now if I click here and go to materials, there we go. Now we've got all of our Redshift options. So if you ever do this and you don't see the Redshift list here, that just means you need to switch your render engine again. Okay, so we're going to start with standard and go from there. And so the standard material looks like this. I'm going to go ahead and just drag this onto the tree. And I'm going to update this. And you'll see that, right, it's given it kind of a shiny appearance, and it's this dark gray material. So let's look at our material settings. So first, we have several options here, and it looks very different than standard materials, but there's things in here that are similar. And you look at this and you're going to be like, oh my God, there's so many things. So the base is basically color and how the light should, whether the light should be diffuse, what type of diffusion. If we change this to this Deon-Lambertian spheres, it's going to subtly change the difference, change that base. We're going to leave this on Oren-Nair. This I can set the primary base color for the object, so you can set this to whatever you would like, right? Maybe let's make the tree like kind of awful. Yeah, that'll work. Okay. All right, so we've got this kind of gross looking tree color. And then there's this weight. Weight is basically how much impact it has on the final image, right? So we have our base color, we have reflection, we have transmission, which we'll talk about later, subsurface sheen, thin film, coat, and emission, and geometry. So let's go through this. So first, if I adjust this weight, if I dial the weight down on my color, it's going to look less bright, right? There's still 100% weight on the reflection, so it's still sharp here, but basically I'm not using as much of this color. It's just going to look darker. And so there's also this diffuse roughness. So if I was to, let's go ahead and turn our reflection all the way, oops. I don't know what just happened. Okay, let's go ahead and turn our reflection all the way down to 0. That's going to help us because everything else, you'll note the weight on all of these other options is set to 0. So this is just our color channel. And you can kind of see how soft this looks, how diffuse that looks. If we boost the metalness up to 1, right, now we can get a very reflective metallic object. It still has that base color involved. If we increase our roughness up to, let's say, 50%, you'll see that should make those highlights a little bit softer and a little bit hazier and more spread out. If I dial this metalness down, again, you'll see what that does is it means that the highlights are even more diffuse and spread out. Does that make sense to everybody? If I set this to 0, we're going to get like sharper highlights, and you can just kind of pay attention to how the shadows and things look here. if I crank it all the way up to 1, that's going to be these are all going to be much smoother transitions, right? There's not going to be basically as much contrast in our highlights. And this actually makes it look kind of floaty or kind of almost like jade in this case. Even though I don't have subsurface scattering on, it's still a very, very diffuse color. It's very rough in that diffuseness. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this back down to 0. So it's just at the default. So as we go through these, we can see what each one of these layers does. Okay, so then we have reflection. So reflection, again, if I boost this up to 1, we're going to get some highlights on top of here. All right, so you can see I'm getting these nice specular highlights. And roughness, if I boost the roughness up here, it's like roughness in the reflectivity channel, right? It's going to do the same thing. It's going to create a more spread out highlight, but again, these highlights are significantly brighter. What's nice about reflection too, and you're like, well, why? You can do the same thing in your color channel. What's different is all of the metalness and everything is going to be impacted by this color. And so in my reflection, I can change this, and I could be like, oh, maybe I want these to be more blue, more teal in the reflections. And so you can see that I can get much more complex colors or much more complex materials this way. If I pull this down again, you'll see that there's a blue teal tint to these reflections. And so when you're working with real world materials and trying to map those, sometimes you'll see like, oh, all of these specular highlights have a tone or a color to them. And then this allows you to add those things to it. Index of refraction, we're not going to worry about that so much right now, but that basically means like how does light bend as it goes through the material. There's anisotropy. If I boost this up to 50%, you can kind of see maybe a little bit of how that's making a difference here, but it's pretty subtle with the material that we're working with right now. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that down. We're not going to worry about rotation. And samples is basically how refined do you want this material to be. 16 is a good start. We're not going to worry about doing any more samples for this tutorial just to make it, because otherwise it slows everything down. So transmission is how transparent is this object. So if I crank this up, you will see the beauty of this model, but you're going to see that it is starting to become transparent. And it's going to be bending light based on the index of refraction above, right? And so this is a transparent material now. It's kind of crazy that you just crank that up and you get transparency. I can adjust color here. The scatter color is also something that can be tweaked and adjusted. I'm not going to worry about too many of these things right now because, again, we're just introducing this. But you can see that you can render transparent materials pretty quickly and easily with this. If I go to the scatter color, let's go ahead and just change this to something else. And let's just see if we can even notice that difference. I don't think I have it really boosted too much right now. Let's go ahead and pop this up here and just see if we get a slight difference. You can kind of see that I'm getting some scatter color in some of these areas back in the background. But again, this is a subtle change that, another tutorial would probably be better to actually look at how this functions. So I'm going to go ahead and set this back to 0-ish. I don't know if I can just right click. Nope. Okay. So I'm going to zero that out. And because transparency does take a while to render, you'll notice it's not as long as in the standard render engine. We will turn this off so we can see these other things. But I'm going to go ahead and pull this all the way back down to 0. But you can experiment with this, play with this, see how changing color and stuff makes a difference in your object and what it looks like. Okay, so there's some other options here we're not going to deal with right now, but subsurface scattering. This is what makes human skin look like human skin. It's what makes wax look like wax. It's when light enters, bounces around, and exits. And wavelengths, red, blue, and green wavelengths, tend to get absorbed at different rates. And so you can kind of set the path lengths and do some other things there. Sheen and thin film also apply essentially a layer on top. Coat is like a glossy coat on the surface. So if I was to, let's just say choose red here and increase the weight, I'm just going to go to 100% to start with. You can see that I'm not really getting a whole lot of variation on here. There's like a subtle addition of things. Again, these are things that maybe if I boost the roughness, we'll get a little bit more. But it basically can allow us to have like another layer of complexity in our materials. I'm just going to see if I can get it to show up at all. You know, it seems like it's not really making a huge impact, but you can kind of see on the edges here where it's a little bit warmer. And that's where we're kind of seeing some of that coat come in. All right, I'm going to pull this back down to 0. And then emission. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the light in our scene off. And you'll see that when you do that, it sets this default light on. It's like awful looking. But I'm going to go ahead and see if I can just boost the emission. What emission does is it actually makes your object glow. Right? It's transmitting light. You can kind of see this on the plane here. I'm going to go up to preferences. Let's see if I can do it here. I can't, I'm sorry. This is one of the things that I kind of forget where this light, where I can turn this default camera off. It might have to be under render settings. Let's see. Redshift, can I turn the default camera off? No. Somebody's going to be like, well, this is how you do it. And I just don't know how to do it. Enable global hair options. Here it is. Okay, so if you go to Redshift, under advanced and globals, go down to default light. If we turn that off, now the only light source in the scene, so if I was to pull this back down to 0, this should go black, right? So now this shows what this is doing. If I increase this, right, this is glowing. And so I'm using this whole object as a light source right now. And so I can adjust the color here, right? I could, you know, make it more of a teal. You can get some really cool effects with this. And again, you can increase that weight up to, and you'll note the slider goes to 2, but there's times when if you have other lights in the scene, or if you really want this to be a light source, you could set this to say 10, right? And that's going to make it that much brighter, right? And note that it doesn't, like 100 would be really intense in terms of a source of light. And you'll notice as it gets brighter, right, this is going to become so bright that it will not, you won't see the actual color, but in terms of watching these different objects and the way the light's playing on the rest of the scene, it's emitting that colored light, but it's just so bright that you can't see it. Okay, so we're gonna turn this back down to 0. We're gonna turn our light back on. And then we're gonna go down to our opacity. And basically what this does is if I adjust the opacity, and I'm just going to go down in the color to about 50% gray. I'm leaving it gray intentionally. I'm going to close this because then that'll update. You'll see that what this does is it makes it transparent without applying the index of refraction, right? So it's not transmission. It's not like it's glass. It's just like it's transparent. And if I turn on thin walled, it may look a little different. It's not thin walled, but it can kind of give you that thin walled appearance. I don't know. And then we can add a bump map, which isn't on here right now. We'll talk about how we do that in just a second. Okay, So these, right, so this allows you to essentially adjust the opacity of the object, but having it be something that's flat, which can be really useful depending on what you're working with. All right, so we're going to bring this back up so it's fully opaque again. And those are the basics of a material. So I'm going to go ahead and stop right now, and then we will continue on in a second section. Remember to save frequently.